The night was finally here, a night months in the making. The arena in Las Vegas was packed to its rafters, buzzing with energy, but under the surface, something felt off. It was more than just pre-fight tension. There was a thickness in the air, a sense of something lurking in the shadows, waiting to be unleashed. Backstage, Jake Paul shook out his arms, psyching himself up. His entourage tried to pump him up, but he couldn't shake an unsettling chill that had clung to him for days. He'd been plagued by nightmares about this fight for the last week, each one darker and more vivid than the last. Shadows seemed to coil at the edges of his vision, whispering his name with a voice that clawed at his bones. He dismissed it as nerves, forcing a cocky grin and reminding himself who he was, who he had to be. Across the hall, Mike Tyson sat in his locker room, alone, his chest rising and falling in controlled, steady breaths. His expression was stony, but there was something uneasy in his eyes, like a man haunted. Over the years, he'd faced demons in and out of the ring, but tonight he sensed something darker. It clawed at the edges of his mind, an insidious whisper in a voice he didn't recognize, but somehow knew. The lights dimmed, and an eerie hush fell over the crowd, their raucous cheers fading into a collective murmur. Jake stepped into the ring first, usually cocky, but his shoulders felt heavier. His gaze kept drifting to the shadows, to the feeling of eyes watching him from somewhere beyond. He shook his head, focusing. He had to. Tyson's entrance music began, but it sounded distorted, slower, with a bass so deep it reverberated through every bone in the audience. Tyson entered, his form powerful as ever, but his face was pale, eyes distant. As he crossed into the ring, his lips moved, murmuring almost as if he were praying or speaking to something that only he could see. The announcer's voice echoed, a distorted drone that barely reached the crowd. Jake looked around, realizing the fans' faces were slack, eyes wide as if caught in some trance. And then just as quickly, the crowd roared back to life, but the cheer didn't sound right. The noise was hollow, empty. The bell rang. Jake stepped forward, fists up. As Tyson studied him with a strange, fixed gaze, Jake threw the first punch, landing a quick jab. Tyson staggered back, but his eyes seemed glazed, as though he were somewhere else. The crowd fell into an unsettling silence as Tyson's body convulsed, his head twitching at an unnatural angle. Jake took a cautious step back. And then, Tyson's eyes changed. The whites were gone, replaced by dark, sunken hollows. A wicked, twisted grin split across his face, too wide, the skin stretching as if it would tear. When Tyson looked up, his pupils were solid black, like pits into an endless void. "Come on, champ! Isn't this what you wanted?" Tyson's voice was low, gravelly, layered with something ancient, something that sounded like a voice trapped between dimensions. Jake threw another punch, but Tyson caught his fist mid-swing, his grip colder than ice, so tight Jake thought his hand might shatter. Tyson leaned in close, his breath thick with the stench of rot, his voice like the whisper of dead leaves. "Did you think you could run from this, Jake?" Tyson hissed, his voice not just his own but laced with others. Whispers, hisses, a multitude of voices crawling up Jake's spine. "I've seen you in my dreams, in my nightmares." Jake jerked his hand away, stumbling back. The arena lights flickered, casting grotesque, strobe-like shadows. In the corners of his vision, Jake saw shapes shifting and crawling, too many limbs, too many eyes. He looked out at the audience, and his heart plummeted. Their faces were twisting, melting, their eyes inky pools of darkness. Their jaws were slack, grins stretched in rictus smiles, staring at him with a hunger that went beyond death. Tyson moved, quicker than any man his age should be able to, lunging with a feral, predatory speed. Jake barely dodged, feeling a rush of freezing air as Tyson's glove whizzed past his face. The crowd gasped, but there was no excitement in their voices, only terror. "Why are you afraid?" Tyson rasped, his voice scraping against Jake's mind. "You called this upon yourself? You wanted this fight, didn't you?" Jake's voice was caught in his throat. He looked around, desperate, but there was nowhere to run. The lights flickered again, and suddenly he wasn't in the ring anymore. He was in an empty, desolate wasteland, a boundless void filled with shadowy figures watching him, their eyes hollow and endless. Tyson stood before him, no longer fully human. His body had elongated, stretched grotesquely, his skin a pale gray, his limbs twisted and unnatural. His eyes were black pits and his smile was impossibly wide, teeth sharp and dark. Who are you? Jake whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Tyson's twisted face leaned close, his voice a guttural growl. I am every nightmare you've ever had, Jake, he hissed, his voice the sound of death itself. And tonight I'll show you what true darkness is. The shadowy figures moved closer, their hands reaching for Jake, pulling him into the darkness. Their touch was ice, freezing his flesh, dragging him down into a realm of shadow and endless terror. He fought, struggling against the clammy hands that clutched at him, but the harder he struggled, the tighter their grip became. He felt himself sinking, drowning in shadows as Tyson's laughter echoed, a sound that would haunt his soul. The arena went dark. When the lights came back on, the ring was empty, save for a single pair of boxing gloves lying in the center, abandoned. Jake Paul and Mike Tyson had vanished without a trace, as if they had never been there at all. The crowd stared, blinking in confusion as if waking from a shared nightmare. To this day, no one knows what truly happened that night, but sometimes if you stand alone in that empty arena, you might hear the faint echoes of laughter, whispers in the shadows, a chilling reminder of a fight that was more than a fight that would never end.